Welcome to another talk on the Congress of Consciousness and Being Yourself. Today we are visiting Dr. Jakob Boesch. Dr. Jakob Boesch was from 1991 to 2006, Practitioner-in-Chief or Chefarzt at the Psychiatric Services Basel-Land and private practitioner of psychiatry and psychosomatic medicine at the University of Basel. He was particularly concerned about mediality and spirituality and connecting this with psychiatry, and to research this scientifically, which, as I find, a very interesting contribution. My first question in all of these talks is, what does it mean for you to be yourself or to be self-aware? Well, it's a very common and daily experience that doesn't really need more realm or definition, but rather, for me, it is about the experience of being able to reflect ourselves and that awareness that everyone has themselves. That, in its principle, is to be self-aware. And here we always encounter things and people that make us revisit these experiences, that make us aware of ourselves again. So what was your first experience with spirituality? Well, I would say spirituality begins when one is born. But I myself had an incisive and profound experience when I was 3, when I was lying on the ground and could feel the ground around me. It was a beautiful day full of sunshine, and I felt that the sun was inside of me, and the sun wasn't there, but it was actually inside of me. I can't exactly remember how long that moment lasted, but I just remember it being a profound experience for me. And in recollection, I would certainly consider that to be a very spiritual experience. And what did that change in you, this particular experience? Well, I don't think I really reflected on that experience again, but I just remember it being of incredibly profound intensity. And it was just so much warmth in me that I remember to have carried on. Not as if the sun was in me, of course it was back in the sky, but there was certainly something that remained in me. And you obviously turned to become a psychiatrist. Yes, that's correct. Did you actually want that, or did you just happen to study that? Well, it happened really that as a son of a farmer, I grew up in the pre-Alps, and my goal was to become Zen in the Alps really. And so I always read quite a lot and was always a devoted and religious child, but equally adventurous and always on the lookout of new things. And so I read a majority of the Karmai books. And after a longer period of an episode feeling very sick due to an endemic hepatitis as a 14-year-old, I was by large parts very isolated during the winters. And it was there that I decided I wanted to become missionary. And by so connecting religion and adventure, it took me really by its grip. And I consider myself lucky to be able to have confessed that to my mother, who, of course, was absolutely shocked. But obviously that was just the beginning. But during my grammar school at the gymnasium, I had a lot of critical questions that arose to just, in general, religion and confession, how we live them and how we understand them. And so I find myself to be reading a lot of books on Indian spirituality. But also when I was 18 or 19, I did a lot of yoga. And so that took me away from becoming a missionary. And meeting another spiritual doctor, I realized that it was actually something wonderful. And I believe that with this way, I can remain concerned about these topics with the choice of my work and profession. But I think I remember all the way until after my studies, my studium, it was clear for me that I was going to be either a neuroscientist or to become a psychiatrist. And so I got a scholarship for basic research of neuroscience, and I was there. But then I realized that I need the contact with humans and the direct impact of that field, and so I changed. The soul of the human seems to be very interesting and intriguing to me as well. How did you manage to deal with different people and these confrontations of souls that are on the one side searching for things, but are also coming to you and request things? Did they stir up things in you as a person? Well, certainly. I think that's difficult to say. But you certainly make a lot more experiences of the most intimate way, because you're very intimate with people. But you also make a lot of experiences of immeasurable pain that these human beings have experienced, which you're really helplessly exposed to, as well as own experiences of pain and suffering that belong to that as well. Just as any psychiatric or psychotherapeutic work of oneself, that always plays a role. And so I always said to myself that I wouldn't hesitate any other moment, and I would do exactly the same thing, possibly just with a few less of detours that I've done. You just happen to have used the word center, and we could only find that center if we go and turn into ourselves and not go to the exterior of oneself. Well, that is correct, that is very often said. But to be honest, I don't really know what that exactly means, to go into yourself. If I reflect on my life, I never really figured that out. And in fact, I've spoken to a lot of patients that somewhere always are in a situation of stress and tension where they say they need to become more spiritual and they want to become more enlightened and become a higher level of themselves and so forth. And I have to really meditate. But I always say, you're already spiritual, and it's only a matter of just recognizing that and just to trust that power that is in you already. And it's not about devaluing or dejustifying your current state, but rather to accept that your current state already is good enough, if one can recognize that. And so over the years, I've developed something like, how shall I say, mantras or favorite sentences and paraphrases. And one of them is that every experience returns to the right moment. And I always say to people to just trust that. Well, I think that is right, that if I think about it myself, then turning into myself means very often to trust my own reaction. Yeah, one could possibly say that it is something you call introspection, and we become self-aware. But to be honest, it very often is more like it is something that plays on the level of compassion and at the level of interconnecting with others. It's not as if we're detaching from that outside, and it's always on that level of interaction with others, with interactions, whatever comes at us. It always is with that interconnection. So it's not as if we just go into ourselves and reflect independently of that, but is always with that connection. So can I ask you, when you review and look back at your life, Could you possibly name teachers that gave you enough trust? Because I can feel that within you there's a lot of trust. Well, I think it's, at first instance, I would need to name Miss Life Experiences, which I suppose has taught me the most, if not all. But of course, no, there has also been people that have been incredibly important, which probably started with my psychoanalyst, Boesch, who is a existence analyst, and who just generally gave me the space, who is known to be very silent, which really is a disreputed form of practice, really. But this secureness that he expressed and could keep with me was something incredibly important. But also there was other people like Ruth Korn. And so I think I really got in touch with a lot of forms in psychiatry and psychoanalysis, and was also in Esalen and Jim Sinke, and so all of the Gestalt therapy, and later bar therapy, family therapy, and all of these people that I met were always distinctively striking personalities who expressed things towards me and had an impact on me. But also at the same time, very early on, I was very intrigued by alternative systems and ways and methods, and a long time did Sofinit, which equally was a very important decision, and also some ideas from Steidner. So I would say, yeah, I probably did bring spiritual healing to the practice of medicine. It probably is somewhere connected, but I was particularly interested in that form of healing and different forms of healing. And so to see how that connects with just general school medicine or Schulmedizin, which in fact is the title of my first book. And there, in fact, at the very beginning was Pamela Sommer, who is very famous about her very peaceful trust that she expresses. But probably I could speak on for several hours about people that I possibly have learned things from. I find it nice and interesting how you say that you learn from others and with the relationship to others, where you say that they are showing you something and you're deciding something, what you take into yourself and what you don't take into yourself. And I don't clam myself onto things, but on a continuous basis I always expand my horizon. Yeah, well, that is in fact correct. I just recently was at myself again as a teacher, and you for many years worked with a spiritual healer, Miss Alklas. Would you ever stand up publicly and say, yes, I did work with that Miss Alklas? Well, it is correct that I started with a Brazilian medium that has spiritual traditions from Kardec, who is a pupil of Pestalozzo, that today is very common in Catholic practice, and I started with him. And later I worked with different spiritual healers, and Anu Klaas is probably the last person that has an expanded self of consciousness. She, in fact, is less of a healer than more of a medium, rather clairvoyance. But before that, I explicitly only worked with partners who worked with healing without contact. Can you please express your experiences with these types of people? How was it for patients, I now refer to them as patients, to have this kind of experience? Well, of course it was very interesting. At the beginning, when I decided to do that, as a practitioner-in-chief or chefarzt, I had profound fear because I was very clear about this institution should not be referred to as cult or sect, by referring practitioners or the general population or social workers who want to expand their knowledge. And so at the very beginning, I went to the director of health and explained to him my situation, what I wanted to do. And undoubtedly I had a lot of criticism with him, especially due to my previous reform efforts in the institution. And so eventually I was able to start. But obviously it was very clear that there was a lot of rejection within the network of colleagues, but also in the political space, and I sometimes was very close to be expelled. I would say the pro-lobby was always a bit stronger than the anti-lobby, and so eventually I pushed through. But certainly, undoubtedly, you revolutionized the system, possibly through a back door, but nonetheless you stayed in the system, and you put these two tracks into this very established psychiatric institution. Well, that's correct. It was certainly exciting, but also a very painful experience. Well, of course, all of these conflicts and tensions did mean a lot of fighting, and I was told that being a public servant, I'm responsible for that amount of people, not only your own patients, but etc., 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 all of these other people I'm responsible for. You can just go into private practice and do all of those things there. And I said, well, certainly that would be more comfortable, and there wouldn't be all of these conflicts and resistances on my way. No, but that was only a short reflection, and I said to myself, I certainly want to stay in public service. So in that way, I must admit I was narcissistic enough to see the public sphere that I had, and I did not want to end up in a corner of my own practice. It looks like your path was one that you had to undoubtedly think about a lot of fears and stress that obviously comes both from the outside and the inside, and you must have been unsecure and you had moments of strength. Could you possibly explain how you managed with that fear, and how did you manage after that? Well, I think I have to admit that from my childhood I had a lot of fear and anxiety, but also as a grown-up adult. And I think for me the important message was that not to fight that anxiety, but to call upon that anxiety. And I want to experience that anxiety to its fullest. And so I moved up into a cabin in the Alps and had the goal to just experience that angst and anxiety to its fullest. And that was very important for me, which connected me a lot with angst and gave me the reflection that the angst doesn't say, release yourself of this anxiety, but rather the anxiety is important and it is our bodyguard, and we can in fact live with that anxiety. But also in psychotherapy there is this tradition which goes, feel the fear and do it anyway. So don't just wait until you have no more anxiety. And I've also noticed that after the last 10 years or so, there's been quite a few people that have visited our courses and quite eloquently described how anxiety awakened them. Or for example, there was this one person that did a lot of free climbing, so without equipment, and she said that she really felt that this anxiety and angst wakes me up where I have to grab the right spots or push myself up at the right spot. And today we have, even crazier things like base jumping. I once heard of professional athletes like Per Bitsunrücken, the ski champion, or Jörg Medapnahaller, the swing athlete.
And Permin, shortly after an operation, he became Olympic winner, and he was asked, well, after many years, how did you have every single meter in your consciousness? And he replied that you just become so self-aware that you do not think about your arms and feet anymore. And everything out of this kick or flash of angst develops. And for example, for the base jumpers, there is also one of the famous base jumpers that saw a hole in a rock of just merely about 2 meters 80, and he decided, I'm going to fly through it. And an absolutely crazy endeavor. And so he trained for it and carefully planned it and eventually flew through it. And he was asked, well, how come you've lost friends, but what do you think your parents would think about this, and what do they say about it? And he replied, of course, it's a lot of anxiety for them when I do these stunts, and stress, but ultimately they know that this feeling of angst, this flash, this kick, is in fact something so great that, in fact, it's worth to risk your life. And I think I can reflect on that, and I think that is my personal experience as well. I can pass that on, that that's the way you should deal with angst and anxiety. Anxiety just is something very important and fascinating and vividly remarkable. Well, one sometimes refers to angst as something that comes from old experiences, and it's just there to tell us not to hurt ourselves again and to re-cause a pain that we've experienced. And to overcome this anxiety allows us, in fact, to experience new things and not to fight anymore, but rather to be with them. Did I understand you correctly there? Well, I think it is true to assume that they can come from old experiences, but they can also be much greater than our life existence, and can in fact go back all the way to the reptiles also. And it's all within our nucleus brain, stored right there. So it's right next to anger, lust, control of vitals, like your pulse, and all of these things. If you think about it, it's all right there in your nucleus. So, in fact, you can realize that angst, in fact, can be a wonderful tool. Of course, as much as it can be a pleasure experience as in that moment itself. But of course, it's even more painful if we try to fight that anxiety and we try to relieve ourselves from that anxiety. And so, how is it for you, for example? Say if a patient comes to you and says, there's nothing I can do anymore. I'm full of anxiety. I can't get out of the house. The classical, one would say burnout syndrome, for example. He's completely ridden by his anxiety. Well, I think my reply would be, feel the fear and do it anyway. And the more one tries to avoid the anxiety, the more, in the end, it will start controlling you. And if you always then tend to avoid things due to your angst, there won't be anything else left but just pure anxiety in your life. And so it's a matter of going back with the angst and taking that path, and not to be controlled by it, but to be helped by the angst on your path. But all the way still go with the experience. For me personally, it's rather important that on a daily practice I have some kind of exercises that I can use in my daily life. Would you have any exercise, for example, when anxiety comes? how in my daily life, just finding a good way of relaxing and dealing with that anxiety. Do you have any exercise? Well, I think at this very moment I must confess I don't have a particular exercise, but rather it is really a matter of just recalling all of this, just as all of these athletes and TV stars, that if I didn't have this anxiety, I wouldn't have played my role as well as I did. I probably wouldn't have that aura to myself, etc. So just to be aware of that, because I think when you say if there's any advice or hints that I can give when you're blocked about your anxiety, I think it's important to acknowledge that that can happen. And we again are very close in trying to remove that angst and get rid of that anxiety. And of course then we shouldn't go that particular path of trying to avoid it or to get rid of it. So my belief, no, I would not be able to any particular advice. Well, I think the more conscious one becomes and the more moments of aha one has, the more you realize what anxiety feels like, and you can accept it. And it becomes less and less eventually. Yes, and I think that's correct to assume that, and science has helped us there. And a very practical experience is that if we have anxiety and we don't want it, then we think that it goes on forever and will never stop. But the experience, in fact, is that anxiety only goes to a certain degree and reduces eventually. So it can't just persist like that at all times. So I often give that as my recommendation. Just don't try and break your anxiety experience too early, but try and go with it. And how it has a peak and then slowly falls off again. Something else I would like to ask you about is, how do you judge your body, and what nutritional advice can you give? Would you have any advice to give us here? Well, I think personally I like to eat and exercise quite a lot and make sure I get enough fresh air, because that is important, and just generally to find a way to exhaust myself, which in fact as a child I had to do due to the heavy workload and just generally arriving on time at school due to the long way I had to travel every morning. And later in secondary comprehensive school I cycled a lot. And so I would say, generally speaking, I was physically always very active. And that always did good for me. What I certainly can't do, and I've had several attempts at it, is meditation. I just simply can't do it. I become very restless, or at times sleepy. But I've also tried things like autogenic training, which I found very beneficial and I could use at times when needed. Well, I have to ask you, so sport obviously is also a form of meditation. Yes, I agree. I think especially skiing is incredibly meditative. This feeling to ski down these mountains is an absolutely limitless feeling. And so when it comes to nutrition, I think very early on I researched alternative nutrition and I asked myself what is healthy and what is not healthy, and read quite a lot of literature on that. And something I also paid a lot of attention to was my eyes, because when I was 19 I had first glasses, and I asked myself, what can you in fact do against that? But I remember that not really working. So can I ask you, you're not a vegan or vegetarian, you just eat what you think is good for you, is that correct? Yes, I think very much so. I try to avoid meats and animal protein. I don't abstain from it, but I'm certainly, at certain periods,
vegan, and I've noticed that it can really reduce the inflammatory processes. And I'm convinced that animal protein, be it milk or meat products and so on, that these increase the inflammatory ability of the body. And just generally speaking, I think I just feel better. I remember being 2-3 months fully vegan, and I later stopped, only to realize that I don't particularly feel that well anymore. And I always tell my children that after 50, 60 years, it's not that easy to just shift your nutrition. Obviously, from time to time, I do eat meat, and especially cheese, I do like from time to time. Can I ask you, it seems that it's also important to give the body what it would like at that very moment. And if it doesn't want that, to just restrain yourself. Yeah, I think in those regards I have a rather peculiar and interesting anecdote, which is that I had a period where I worked with Peleazoma and we supervised doctors, and at some point a doctor came up to me and said, well, since quite a time now I don't eat any meat anymore, and Pamela replied, well, really, so you've not been eating meat for quite some time? And the doctor replied, well, yesterday I had a sausage. And Pamela laughed and said, well, how come you had that idea to eat meat again? Did your body say that to you? You shouldn't eat any meat anymore? And he replied, well, no, it doesn't seem to be healthy for me. And Pamela only replied, the way you're saying this to me, it seems that your body is telling you not to restrain yourself from meat. It's requesting meat. So can I ask you, it seems that you're saying it's very important to realize what our body is and to become more conscious, works and functions. Yes, I think I agree. In a lot of things you can experience yourself. Yeah, it's rather extraordinary what your body can do, and you should give it back in balance so that it can feel well. Can I ask you another question, which is, what have people experienced, especially in terms of your spiritual work that you've done and psychiatric work that you've done? How did clients feel about it? I think I can answer that question as only to say it's been very different. I think in my experience, and again I'm referring here to the spiritual healing, I think there is something that you can call miracles. I think I've certainly experienced that. And what the reason is really, what lies behind all that, if it's either the person that you're dealing with and it just clicks, or that person is really helping you with different energies and transferring that energy to you, or whatever that may be. I would say that in general these miracle healings are somewhere below the mark of 10%. And just generally the people have a lot of false expectations when they approach this form of healing. And of course, as a practitioner, I'm part of that process, and I'm guilty to be making these mediums more accessible and presenting these prime examples. And I think you develop a wrong picture. But also there's also very beneficial effects after a long period of time with lots of sittings and sessions, which I personally have experienced. But I think in general it's very, very different. There is people that have come and said, yes, well, my insurance doesn't pay, etc., etc., etc. So for me it's the only thing, and I'm happy to sacrifice my holidays and take the time and the money to give this healing a try. Some people are very thankful about that offer, others were very disappointed, and I think in general people become disappointed when they go to that service and think it's a one-time session and they come back healed. So I think in general there's a spread of misjudgment about these healing practices that we need to think about. For example, I had once a healer come to me who practiced herself and said that 7 years ago she noticed a tumor, and she noticed that it grew after 2 years, and eventually she went to another healing professional who was on the alternative medicine side of things herself, and said she analyzed it and with the energy, and she confirmed that it's not a bad tumor, it's a good tumor. And just then eventually she just wasn't happy with that decision and went back to general Schulmedizin or school practice, and they confirmed that it was a malignant tumor already with metastasis. And she said, I don't want to be operated, I want to live. And so she eventually came to us and said, Miss Class, please try and make these cells good again and reverse their progress.
I think it is wrong to believe that you can change the outcome of malicious cells in your body and to turn them into good ones just by the ability of your mind. I think those are just general misconceptions. And something I recall as well is that during this talk, Anouk was drinking Coca-Cola, which is known to be very harmful. That, this woman that a lot of people respect was drinking Coca-Cola is in fact quite a discrepancy of what we want and what we put in our mind, that it's not strong enough to neutralize our desire for the drink. But at the same time, we have enough mind power to heal ourselves from malignant cells and the tumor in our body. And can I ask you, it seems that there is a general conception of people that say, you have to heal me. Yes, that's correct. And I think there's a lot of people that take school or general medicine. And I think that's what I keep saying, is that just use that availability and really make use of that service in your country. It's obviously you can use the other, but just make sure that you have both alternatives. And I think more profoundly, there's a lot of patients that just miss these opportunities with these conceptions. So I think it is important to also turn to general medicine. Can I just ask you as a concluding question? You early on mentioned that spirituality is something else than spiritual healing. Could you please explain what you mean by that? Yes and no. And as I said, there is one life that can be not spiritual, which is a question of values. I couldn't say that there's no life that is not spiritual. And there's a lot of people that say, well, it was at that moment that I sought out the spiritual path. But what I see as a central element of spirituality is, in fact, just the reflection of there being a sustainable power that, in fact, is inherent to ourselves. And it's right there within us. And there's a lot of people that go out to look for love everywhere in the world, and they ask themselves the question, how can I love? Without realizing that it is there within them. And the love that I get from others is always limited and, in fact, rather short-lived. We need a dose very soon. And so I think that insight that we have that power within us, it is there inherently. And in fact, we can activate it at any time when we just connect to our existence and consciousness. I think I would call it the spiritual consciousness. Thank you very much for your insights on spirituality and your time. Thank you.